Many of us have heard of the tragedy of the commons, and especially the version in sort of promoted or mentioned by an American scientist, Garrett Hardin. Garrett Hardin said one of his more ambitious statements: "Freedom in a commons brings ruin to all." Right? And Hardin popularized the term tragedy of the commons. And if I might just bring it to a poignant conclusion about Hardin, Hardin and his wife committed suicide in order to reduce the environmental burden on the world. They waited till they were quite old, so I'm not exactly sure how much sacrifice they were making, but they committed suicide. So here's how Hardin characterized the tragedy of the commons. First of all, he accepted the economist's notion of individual rationality focused upon the things that matter to you. Even good things, in the economic model of rationality, even good things are things that you're valuing, and we may differ in our valuations of them, right? And we may, some of us may want a whole lot of certain good things, but the net result of individual rationality in a context where you have items that are hard to put into private property, then you end up with overuse of the asset or the good. For example, pasture land, right? Unless it's well, even potentially if it's individually owned, but certainly if it's not individually owned, you can have some people who allow their animals to stay a little longer, take their animals out earlier, etc. And so Hardin argues that property rights don't provide enough of a constraint on individual action to prevent the potential for a tragedy of the commons. The global environment for him is the commons, right? And overuse, right, is a result. And so here's two pictures from North America, well, South America and North America, that we have all heard about, right? We've all heard about South American forest fires, Brazil and elsewhere now, and the pollution, but also the burning of the forests. And in the American West, we actually have a horse problem. Several of the national parks, because national parks are a commons, several of the national parks that don't get a lot of people who go to them do actually have large number of horses that are causing environmental damage to the park because they're wild horses, so there's no ownership of them. They simply move wherever they want to move. And so the wild horses in the American West. These are examples. There's many other examples, right? Pollution, etc. Overuse can't be stopped or controlled unless we take drastic measures. That's the Hardin story. The Hardin story is that unless we take firm government control of whatever asset it is that's the commons, then we will experience tragedy. For him, it's not a maybe. It's we will, and hence he and his wife ended their lives. So here's the typical story. So this is just for the logic, to understand the logic of the tragedy of the commons. If we don't have private property rights, then individuals, in this case cows, could be human beings for other uses, will overgraze. Or any of you ever been in a mosh pit at a concert? I almost died in a Tragically Hip concert. And the younger people here have never heard of the Tragically Hip. And some of the older ones haven't either because it's a Canadian band. But the Tragically Hip are the most amazing band in Canadian history. And I was at an outdoor concert, and I literally could not maintain my balance, and had to try to get myself. I got myself out and basically fell out of the mosh pit area. But if I had fallen inside, I could easily have been trounced upon, certainly harmed, if not worse. So tragedy of the commons, we get overgrazing. This creates a prisoner's dilemma situation. Right? So essentially, the tragedy of the commons is a multiplayer prisoner's dilemma game. A prisoner's dilemma game is a game in which I have a reason to make a choice that helps me but may well harm you because of the payoff structures. And so the tragedy of the commons is everybody is in this position in the commons. It's not just the play between you and I. Right? For example, you may hire me to do a job on your basement. Right? I come in, I do the job on the basement, but I use cheap materials because why should I spend a lot of money on your basement, especially since you're paying me? If you're not really paying attention or if you don't know better, I'll use cheaper material. I would never do this, of course. Never, ever. I might use cheaper materials to cut my costs, and that way I make a little bit more money, right? That's the prisoner's dilemma situation. The other side of the exchange doesn't know that I am defecting on them. Okay? And that's the prisoner's dilemma. When it's multiplayer, it's the tragedy of the commons. And so Hardin's response was that coercion is needed to prevent the cheating, defecting. By the way, when I haven't done this at Arizona State, but at Michigan State, I taught a course called Political Economy, and so we dealt with Ostrom. So the first day of class, I told the class, come to class next time, bring a pen, nothing else, because we're going to play a game. The game is called the cooperation game. Okay? And so they come to class, and as they come in, I had one of my faculty colleagues, and all of my faculty colleagues wanted to do this, so I could just rotate it among my faculty colleagues, because they all wanted to see how this worked out in class. So they would record the students' names so that we could keep track of what was going to happen. And once more or less everybody was there, whoever was going to be there was there, the game would start. And the students had the instructions, and the instructions said, when we start the game, 2 students will be called to the front. As you come forward, you will notice that there's a space in front of the table at which you're going to sit that provides a little bit of room. If you wish to have a conversation with the person that you're going to be playing this game with, you may do so. But once you sit down at the table, and the table was like this, and they sat at the end, and I had a big cardboard screen that allowed them to look at each other, but didn't allow them to see what the other one was writing. And I said, you have 2 options. If you write anything else down, you automatically fail. Okay? There's 2 options. You can either write down an A, or you request a grade. You can either write down an A, or you can request a B. So how does the payoff structure work? I bet some people here can figure this out. If both players write down a B, what happens? They get a B because they're cooperating. So both players have cooperated. Are you guys in university or late high school? University? Would you ever request a B for a grade? No. Yeah. I've had students look at me like, I can't accept a B. And I'm like, that's fine. Now you're going to get an F. I can't accept an F. This is I have to have an A. But A means you're cheating on the other person. And if you both cheat on each other, you end up with a D. By the way, if you write down an A and the other person writes down a B, you get your A and they get an F. Now, you can design that payoff structure. That is the structure of the prisoner's dilemma, the tragedy of the commons in a multiplayer game. It's hugely fun. We once had a student who announced up front he could not accept anything other than an A. So he just told the whole class, I cannot accept anything other than an A. And of course, he didn't get an A, and he was furious. But he was like, you just told everybody what you were going to do, and they don't care about your problem. They care about their problems, right? By the way, I paired him with the student who was the most gentle soul you've ever met, and who had taken several courses with me. He was actually from Kenya, had grown up on the streets in Kenya, and just an amazing story. But I knew that he would be generous, and so he was, to a certain extent. But it was a lot of fun. So I've done this many times, and you get all kinds of reactions. So I had a girl walk up. It happened that I picked a couple. I didn't know they were a couple. She walked up to him, batted her eyes at him, said, of course I'm going to write down a B. Then she wrote down an A. They split in class. They split up in the class. Also, nobody trusted her after that. For the second round, nobody would, write down. And she was like so contrite. She wrote down a B and hence failed on the second round because so the tragedy of the commons, right, is this problem we have. We are self-interested, and we want, by self-interest, to be, let me be careful. We have goals that we wish to pursue. They don't have to be selfish goals. They just have to be my interest. Okay? I can try to be buying things for homeless people. The only thing I can't do is take the merchant's interest as my own while I'm buying goods for homeless people. Because if I put the merchant's interest at the forefront, then I pay too much, right? So I can even value somebody else on whose behalf I'm an agent. And of course, in the tragedy of the commons situation, we have this complicated because in the tragedy of the commons situation, we have a lot of people interacting. So we don't know all the people that we should be contracting with, right? In the South American forest fire context, right? It may be your actions that caused the forest fire, but you may not really realize that. Or you may have taken an action and that leads a few days later to a forest fire because you set some conditions that lead somebody else in their actions that creates a forest fire. So the tragedy of the commons is this notion that self-interested individuals operating cooperatively or collectively may not do the thing that's best for the whole. The argument, and so economists universally believe that you must, if you're going to have any successful dealings with the tragedy of the commons, you're going to have to impose private property. So a typical game, you may have played this game, set out, put a tape on the floor in squares. Everyone is assigned a square, and the professor dumps a whole bunch of candy on the square. And, you're supposed to get your squares. But if you happen to get a little more as you go along, right, it's yours. And it becomes chaos and people are fighting over the candy and all that. And that's the notion of the tragedy of the commons. It gets overused, it gets abused, it gets trampled upon, it doesn't get cared for. Who's going to maintain the commons when they can't be certain that they're going to get their share of that commons? Right? So all those questions. So will cooperation alone succeed? And the actual answer is no. Cooperation alone doesn't do it. However, there are some tools we can use that will help us think about the tragedy. It doesn't solve the tragedy of the commons, but does help us cope with it. But before we do that, I just want to talk about also about sort of what kind of goods the tragedy of the commons is about. Okay? So all of you, how many of you have seen versions of this diagram with the words club or toll goods? Anybody who hasn't seen those terms? So that's like take a golf course. A golf course is like a commons, but because you can put fences around it, and you can put a gate, and you can require people to pay to be a part, or require people to join the club to be a part, you can take a commons and you can make it a private property, but a private property for a group. There's still a probability that it will be abused, but it's a much lower probability because it's being managed by a group who have an incentive to keep it going. So club or toll goods, anybody drive the Indiana freeway to come here? Nobody? Okay. The Indiana Tollway is a toll road. Ohio is not a toll road, is it? Yeah, it is. Okay. So a toll road has the same kind of feature. Right? It's not a perfect solution, but the people who are driving on that road choose that road, and that road then gets money that ends up being a little bit better provision for the care of the highway than other highways. You get this, especially if you drive from here to Chicago. All of you know, those of you who live in Chicago know the difference between driving here on the toll road versus driving on the other roads. Private goods are, my shoes, right? We can't share these. Right? You don't want to share them. So they're private, right? So it's one person, one good. Public goods, unfortunately the people who invented the term public goods automatically assumed that they were going to be provided by the public. But they're actually wrong about that. Many public goods are provided by private sources. So it's not a perfect solution, but it is a solution. Ronald Coase wrote a famous book about lighthouses. Both John Stuart Mill and Paul Samuelson said that lighthouses were public goods because there's no way they could be provided by any other means than by ownership by the government. And Ron Coase, being Ronald Coase, said, let me look. Oh, in England, they had this institution called Trinity House. Trinity House is an organization set up by ports, by the seamen's associations, by the harbor associations of the different cities, and everyone pays into Trinity House, and Trinity House maintains the lighthouses, decides upon locations for new ones, and also pays a pension to the families of seamen who are lost, on wrecks on the English coastline. In post-World War II, the British government said, "That's stupid. We're going to eliminate this. We're going to take all those people who are receiving a Trinity House pension, and we're just going to put them on the welfare rolls. Okay. Which would you rather be receiving? A pension that is connected to, that connects you to the people for whom your family member died, potentially for services that your family receives through that organization that's directly connected to the loss of your loved one, or to go on the welfare rolls. Right? Trinity House provided more income, had a whole bunch of services that were provided for individuals and families, retirement, and things like that. And all of that just disappeared and was rolled into the welfare rolls. British welfare was even more horrid than others. So common pool resources then have long been thought to combine elements of both like private goods and public goods. But they're common pool because they are provided collectively, not individually. Usually they can be natural or human created. It may be costly to exclude people. I always forget. In the state of Michigan, anybody live on a lake in the state of Michigan? I can't remember. I think it's the case that in the state of Michigan, if there's a stream that feeds into the lake that your cottage is on, that a person can walk in on that stream and then walk on the beach, but they couldn't go onto your property. But in some other states, they can't even walk the stream and walk onto your lake shore. And so, because any part of anything that touches the lake belongs to the common pool. Utah made, there's been a big fight over this last few years. Utah made all waterways public access. So you could canoe in, park underneath my deck, have a party. As long as you didn't step onto the stream's bank, you could toss your trash over there. Not that you would be, you might get a fine for littering, okay? But it wouldn't be it wouldn't be illegal to do that. Okay? So in common pool resources, it's costly to exclude people. It's also costly to sustain the common. Just think about it as a lake that's stocked with fish, right? Eventually, if it's only stocked once, eventually it'll be fished out. So there's a cost to maintaining the stock, and that's that connects to the last point there. So this is what we're talking about now. All of those things are the reasons why Hardin's logic made lots of sense. And people just regularly assumed that commons were a terrible arrangement, and that we probably should convert them either to private property or to government or state-owned or collectively owned property. Eleanor Ostrom, however, came on with a different analysis. I need to say a few things about Eleanor. She went by Lynn, so I'll say a few things about Lynn. First, Lynn was married to Vince Ostrom. Vince Ostrom was a political theorist in the Tocquevillian tradition. That should signal something, right? What's Tocqueville about? What? Yeah, community, right? He's about communities working together, for their good, right? Raising a barn, right? That's what's an example that he uses. Vince also developed out of Tocqueville's logic a theory about what he called polycentricity. That is, you can have multiple levels of authority inside one sort of place. So, we're standing here, there are rules that the ownership of this building, maybe, I don't know if it's owned by the hotel, I don't think so, I think it's owned by the city. So there's rules about what we can do here. So we have, but then this building is building is part of a city. That city is part of a state. There's state laws that may affect certain things, and then there's federal laws that affect this. There might be others as well. Okay? So that sort of polycentricity notion is the notion that, okay, you have this, but it's not just one set of rules. In fact, some not infrequently have conflicting sets of rules over the same place. Lynn wrote a book, Governing the Commons, hence the title of the talk, that she wrote back in 1995. It took her another 15 years to win the Nobel. But the book went a long way to pushing her towards that. And Lynn won the Nobel in 2010 and is the first female to win the Economics Nobel Prize. The day she won, I actually was out bike riding with my best friend, who's a professor of economics at Michigan State. He's just retired. He's moving to Notre Dame, so we might get him to Acton at some point. He said, we did an afternoon ride. He said, well, so I went into the lunchroom, and everybody at the table was like, who the hell is this woman, Lynn Ostrom? Like, we never heard of her, never seen her name in the American Economic Review, never seen her name in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, never heard of her, never seen her. No, this is terrible. And so, fortunately, my friend Jeff is a very gentle soul and has that way of being able to, even if he doesn't completely agree with something, he will sort of press the point. Because he was very skeptical when I talked to him about Ostrom's work. But he suggested 2 or 3 reasons why they might want to pay attention to Lynn's work. And some of those are things we're going to talk about here. But she challenged the conventional wisdom, this is the Nobel Committee, by demonstrating how local property can be successfully managed by a local commons without the necessity of regulation by a central authority or by complete privatization. So, the traditional argument has been you either privatize or you go to complete central authority. And the argument of the Nobel Committee said she at least showed us. She shared the Economics Prize in 2010 with an economist, Oliver Williamson. Any of you ever heard of Oliver Williamson? We don't have economists in this group too much. Oliver Williamson did a lot of work on economics and firms. So if you think about it, a firm sits between markets and individuals, markets and the state. And so the Nobel went to Lynn Ostrom and Oliver Williamson. Oliver Williamson's work has been on the economics of management, the economics of managing a firm. A firm has a kind of commons-like nature to it, so the two went together. Unfortunately, immediately after the receipt of the Nobel, and maybe even before she had received the Nobel, her doctors informed her that she had terminal cancer, and she died in 2012, I believe. At her death, she was involved in over 200 projects around the world that demonstrated that local commons can be managed, at least to a certain extent, successfully, if central authorities don't micromanage. Okay? So, and in the period of time once she was diagnosed with cancer to her death, she said to her doctors, I would like to visit all 200 projects that we are working on. Can you keep me alive long enough to do that? I don't know whether she did or not. but I know she lived for a couple more years and traveled quite a bit. She was, by the way, located at the University of Illinois Bloomington, and her legacy is moving forward in a couple places. At University of Illinois, they have an Ostrom workshop. This was the workshop that Lynn and Vince set up, and which brings in scholars and people work. They also had funding which enabled them to bring people in for a year, maybe even 2 years, to work on extended projects. They had all kinds of partners in all kinds of other places. Kind of interesting for me, I didn't know this at the time when I made this choice, but as I said before, I'm now at Arizona State University. She actually was supposed to move to Arizona State University. They actually set up a center for her at Arizona State University with a number of scholars who are very Ostrom related. They have quite a group, even bigger than the University of Illinois, of people who do Ostrom-related projects. And she was going to move there, but when she discovered she had cancer, that sort of stopped it, because why should she move to Arizona and then die? So she did not come to. The product of her work was not an economic theory of the commons. Instead, the product of her work were a set of governing principles that you need to think about as you manage a commons. And if you can answer sort of yes and no to different ones, it's going to affect how you manage your commons. So these are the things you need to think about. And I will go through these in more detail. But you have to have defined borders. By the way, I tend to be an open borders person. So I struggle with this a little bit. But at the same time, I understand the logic and partly because of things like the Newfoundland fisheries and what happened there, and the need to define some boundaries there. The wild horses I had before. How do we think about this explosion of wild horses across the American West? Do we kill them all? Do we somehow gather them into a defined space? They're destroying private property, et cetera, et cetera. What do we do about situations like that? Second principle, the rules you establish have to meet the local needs and conditions. One I loved in her stories about this was there was a community that had a fishery. The fish came in from the ocean into this large bay, and they would swing in, and then they would swing around and swing out. So everybody kind of gets two chances. But they couldn't, because of the seasonality of the fish movements were more or less governed by the temperatures of water. So what they did over time was they developed a lottery. So they mapped out on a grid on the bay that the communities surrounded. They mapped out on a grid spots, fishing spots. And then they had a lottery for the fishing spots. So, reach into a barrel, pull out a number. Gustavo, you're number 3, right? And everybody knew where spot number 3 was. Okay. Now, what that meant was that watching, because all the fishers were watching the movement of the fish, on the day when the most fish would be entering into your zone, were you going to show up at 4 o'clock in the afternoon? No. You were going to show up at 5 o'clock in the morning. But on a day when you didn't have, right, the priority of fishing in your spot, then you weren't really losing anything because you were going to get your chance. Right? And there were really stiff penalties if you tried to go out ahead of time. And like, it's like, what if I go out before the sun rises and I can capture a few fish off of my, this other spot before I slide over to where I'm supposed to be so nobody sees me. It probably happened, but they worked to set up a system that was fair, and then they patrolled it, right, to maintain some order. Again, notice the people who are being affected by the commons are the ones who are setting up the rules. Okay? I have lived in a number of communities where the company that built the community decided upon the rules of the common spaces. Why not let the residents who are using participate in setting up the rules? Simple process. A big one, ensure that outside authorities respect the rulemaking rights of the community members. The Newfoundland fishery is a classic tale. The Newfoundland fishery, which the Ostroms were involved in, it was a multi-year decision to do a whole bunch of things to reduce the output of the Newfoundland fishery in order to save the cod fishing period, because it was about to be wiped out. And they did a number of things. For example, they actually moved villages, or were going to move villages, to other locations. People were going to give up their traditional fishing and go work in other places or work in the fishery, in the fisheries, or the canning of the fisheries, of the fish. And there was many group and multi-layered agreement that was in place, or almost in place. And then Canada had an election. And a new federal party won the election. And the morning after the election, the Minister of the Environment stood up in Ottawa. By the way, if you drive north from New York City, where in Canada will you end up? It's a pretty simple answer. Montreal. Okay. From Montreal to Halifax is an 11 to 12 hour drive. Okay. That's a long way. Okay. Ottawa is further than Montreal from the Newfoundland fisheries, Newfoundland and Nova Scotia and that area, Prince Edward Island stuff. And stood up and said, as of this morning, we are shutting down the Newfoundland fishery for 50 years. There was a program in place that would have allowed the fishery to continue in a way that was sustainable, at least appeared to be sustainable. Perhaps it might not have been. At the same time, I don't think that the government even knew that that plan was around. I think they just said, we have to do something about the fishery, let's shut it down. And they just shut it down. Monitoring. Graduated sanctions. I bet you do this with your kids. Does your kid get the worst penalty possible for the first offense? Maybe I shouldn't ask that. Maybe it depends upon how severe it is. But does the kid get the worst penalty for the first offense? Or is it like, okay, look, you don't do this. Here's what you're going to do. Let me talk to you and teach you about this. This is why we do this, etc. Right? So, and if they continue to do it, you start escalating, right? You like, okay, look, this isn't working. You obviously aren't going to obey this rule, so we're going to have to impose a steeper penalty. By the way, this is good parenting tips too. Okay. Some free parenting advice, compliments of the Ostroms. Low cost means for dispute resolution. Don't assume that a dispute requires the maximum, right, tension. Like sometimes disputes are just like small things. So figure out lower cost means, and then build responsibility for commons government into nested tiers. So think of a commons, like a lake, as being governed at multiple levels. The owners of the properties around the lake, the rules that the state or the federal government has about the use of lakes, the rules that the state has about communities that reside on lakes, the federal government's rules, right? Like think of it as a layered process, right? Okay, so now, so here are some examples of Ostrom's principles at work. How many of you had dogs and go to dog parks? Just one. It's too bad. 2, 3. Okay, what are the rules for your dog parks?
My wife takes the dog.
Ah, okay. You don't have any clue.
Well,
Okay.
I work for the city administrator. The dog parks are city amenities.
Right, but so what are the rules for the dog park? Do you know?
They're allowed to be unleashed and run around. There's some sort of etiquette about interaction. I mean, you clean up after your dog, so I think number one, you clean up your own house.
Are these posted? Are these publicly accessible?
Yeah, and
Okay.
we don't have a lot of aggressive enforcement. Boise, a city nearby, has aggressive enforcement. But you do the cost benefit analysis on the cost of enforcement.
And do you trust dog owners to be people who might actually not be that much of a threat to city security?
Correct, and there's enough compliance that.
Go ahead.
So in our case in Mumbai, we have a dog park, so there are no notifications of placards of lakes that says that you have to clean up. It's presumed that you have to do that. If you don't do, others will be like looking at you.
Okay, so there's social pressure, but you don't know that there's any, yeah.
There is sanction. People know that you'll be fined or something like that. But it doesn't sort of display anything.
Right, okay. Yeah. A long list of don'ts. Yeah.
One thing is interesting that no kids allowed alone.
Uh,
They are not allowed to play in the things that are for dogs.
right, yeah.
So we have to
Yeah, any other dog park stories? So in the Tempe area, there's a park that has a small dog park and a big dog park. And in the big dog park, throwing the ball and a little bit of roughhousing is expected. In the small dog park, you can throw the ball and people will go and get it, and the dog will go and get it. And but there's a much, because the smaller dogs aren't in with the bigger dogs. There's not the threat, right? That some bigger dog is just going to roll right over top of a smaller dog. Dog parks are really interesting because some cities have massive lists. In some cities, just say, be polite. Like common decency, we sort of all know what common decency is, be polite. Interestingly, I was in Washington Square in New York City, and there's only one rule in the dog park in Washington Square, which is clean up after your dog. That's the only rule. But it's a really small park. So it's probably not, and most of the people who would be using it are people who live in the surrounding apartments, so they may not have big dogs. They may only have, small or medium-sized dogs. And there's a culture as well. It's sort of take into effect the culture of the town. Okay? Dog parks are just endlessly fascinating in terms of rules. So I hope I turn you on to going and looking at dog park rules when you're driving around. Yeah. This example is one that's very famous, and the Ostroms talk about this in the Swiss Alps. During the summer, cattle are taken, and also other, maybe like horses and the like, are actually taken to the upper elevations. So all the cattle are privately owned, but they are on a common property, and the older men and the younger boys are the ones who go up and live up there, up in the upper elevations for the whole summer, and so that they have people who are tending to the animals, but they're not. But they all just share the responsibility. It's not like I'm keeping my cow away from your cow. It's just all a common space. And you'll see in the Swiss Alps, you'll see this kind of common pasturing. So this is where they have the big cowbells, right? And different people have different cowbells, so that you can tell whose cows are whose too, among other things. This is another Ostrom one. This is a fascinating story. So in Japan, a village was set, and there's multiple villages like this, set on a small inlet off the shore of Japan that was just by nature, that's okay, by nature, perfect for pearl growing, for pearl beds. And so over time, people realized this, that they were pearls down there, and they started harvesting them, tending for them, caring for them. But there was a limited supply, and so they wouldn't allow the village to grow. So they actually, so here are the rules. 2 daughters from any family can stay in the village. The oldest male child has to marry a woman from another village. Any other male child has to leave. Just can't stay home. Go. You're out of here. And I don't know about extra women. More kids, more female children. The pearl divers, so what this does is it constrains the number of pearls that can be harvested in each season. And also, so they've massaged the rules so that they can get the sustenance of the pearl bed over time. But so that the pearl beds continue over time, but they also can harvest each year and sell them. And it was just a fascinating, because it goes even to who can marry who, and who has to leave the village, and all those things. And then I start thinking about in English society, first sons had to join the military, and second sons often went into business, and third sons became academics, and so these kind of commons governance extend to human beings as well as others. These are the Batwa people, are the ones that we have traditionally called pygmies, and they actually tend the forest. We didn't realize this for a very long time, but they actually tend the forests in Central Africa and assist in various ways with maintaining this common property of the forests of Central Africa. And in Canada, there's a fish weir. It's on the west coast. It's inland from Vancouver, but on the Fraser River, And it's a very important salmon stream. So you would not want to overfish the salmon. And so they developed a system whereby you can see here's the weir, the fishing weir, but there's places in the weir where the fish can actually go through. There's only a few places where they would actually catch fish. So they've created a context in which, yes, you can fish, but the fish can actually get through. They're not all trapped and hence all caught. There are also some other rules about that. That's Vincent and Eleanor. She went by Lynn. Vince and Lynn in a irrigation system. That's one of their very common kinds of projects. I don't know if you know that Apache software, every single one of you in this room is running on a piece of Apache software on your phone. Apache software is a collective commons in which people design small programs that do specific tasks on your phone. And many, many, many companies utilize the products that are made. And you contribute to that. If you contribute a program to that, you're just contributing a program to it. You don't get any money out of it. You just have contributed a program that solves a particular problem. These are all these like micro programs, right? Like turning on and off a switch or that kind of thing. Yeah. Yeah. So, and there is, if you click on, if you go to Apache software and watch the movie, you can see the history of this is now almost 50 years old. So this is a sustainable commons, not, yeah, go ahead. It's somewhere on the border. Yeah. I tend to call it a commons because it's governed as a commons, as opposed to governed by like a board or a government official or something like that. So so they have a there are people who make sure programs work and things like that, but that's just contributing to making sure the software is workable and continuing. Yes. Well, yeah, it is time for questions, and whoops, where's my which clicker am I using now? I think this is the end. Oh, this one. I just wanted to take a minute and ask you about the commons of the church. Okay. Have you thought about the governance of your church as the solution to a collective action problem? There's a massive collective action set of issues here. Is it top-down governed or not? Here, is this top-down? This is Eastern Orthodox. Is this top-down governance? We tend to think of it as top-down governance, but it might not be. It's got multiple layers of governance, all kinds of governance structures. This is a soup kitchen in a Winnipeg Anglican church. They have it every Sunday. There's the commons. Notice, we would say, or at least in some of the traditions you're in, they would say, this is a great fellowship building. So, right. But it's a commons. And it can break down. Very quickly, actually. Some people are laughing from experience, maybe. And here's a church that is no longer being used as a church and is therefore then being taken down, and it's going to become public property. And so the government, the city government, took it over because the church defaulted on the property. Did you know that the Internet Archive is housed in the church? This is the Internet Archive. It's housed in a former church. A commons sitting inside what used to be a commons of a different kind, being repurposed to another commons, right? The Internet Archive, which is a collective that manages and saves perpetually, constantly, new websites.